Fear is a strange thing. It can protect us when danger is real, but it can also destroy us when it festers in the imagination. The Whitlow family of 1895 lived in a world where fear was more than an emotion. It was a prison. Every choice they made, every rule they passed down, every bond they clung to was wrapped in chains of dread. And like most prisons, the cell door was locked from the inside. The Whitlows were not poor in the way most people imagine poverty. They owned land, livestock, and had roofs strong enough to weather the Virginia storms, but in their minds they were paupers, paupers in luck, paupers in safety, paupers in peace. They believed their bloodline was cursed, haunted by forces too dark to fight. Stories of demons stalking their families stretched back generations, whispered across candle-lit tables and repeated at firesides until children learned to fear shadows more than hunger. It began with the death of an ancestor, Thomas Whitlow, who, according to local lore, had dabbled in occult practices to bless his farm. When his cattle began to die mysteriously and his firstborn was found lifeless in the crib, the family believed he had struck a deal with darkness that carried a price no Whitlow could ever escape. From that point forward, tragedy after tragedy was not seen as misfortune, but as proof of the curse. By the time the 1890s arrived, this fear had twisted into obsession. The Whitlows refused to marry outsiders. Why? Because they believed that outsiders carried open doors, doors through which demons could slip inside the family. By keeping marriages in the blood, they thought they were building a wall strong enough to keep the curse contained. What they didn't see was that their fear of letting others in was the very thing that kept them locked in suffering. The children of the Whitlow family grew up beneath this shadow. Bedtime stories weren't about heroes and victories. They were warnings about demons that watched from the tree line. The wind at night wasn't just weather. It was a spirit passing judgment. Every illness, every accident, every stillbirth was not seen as natural tragedy, but as punishment, as proof that the curse was alive and watching. This fear poisoned even moments of joy. A baby's cry was met with love but also with worry. Would this child live? Would the curse take them too? Weddings meant to be celebrations were carried out in secrecy and shame, because each time a Whitlow married a Whitlow, neighbors whispered louder. And funerals became rituals of trembling, with family members muttering prayers, sprinkling salt, and drawing protective marks on gravestones as though they could outwit the demons they believed were chasing them. What fear did most was rob the Whitlows of vision. They couldn't see a future beyond survival. The children weren't taught to dream about careers, travel, or marriage into kind and loving families. Instead, they were raised to guard, to hide, and to continue the same cycle. Fear convinced them that stepping outside would invite disaster, so they folded inward, collapsing their possibilities until their bloodline was a tightening noose. The tragedy here isn't just the acts of inbreeding or the strange rituals, it's that fear blinded them from truth. They never stopped to question if their curse was real, if their tragedies were perhaps the same hardships every family faced in those days of hard living, poor medicine, and rough conditions. Instead, fear handed them an explanation that felt powerful: demons. And once they believed it, they clung to it with desperation. Fear is persuasive. It tells you it is keeping you safe while it slowly suffocates you. That was the Whitlow family's reality. They married their own children, not out of love or ignorance, but out of terror. They convinced themselves it was holy protection when in truth it was self-destruction. They prayed, but their prayers were driven more by dread than by faith. They worked their fields, but every crop failure was a sign of wrath. They bore children, but every child was a living reminder that the curse still stalked them. Neighbors noticed the toll. Children looked pale and frail, their features showing signs of a bloodline stretched too thin. Women carried haunted eyes, men carried trembling hands. But when outsiders offered help, or when pastors spoke of God's mercy rather than demons, the Whitlows recoiled. Fear had convinced them that even kindness was a threat. And so the family remained haunted, not by actual demons, but by the shadow of their own belief. Fear had made them prisoners, and worse, it had become their inheritance. Parents passed it to children, children to grandchildren, until the bloodline itself was steeped in terror. This is where the Whitlows leave us a painful lesson. Fear, if left unchecked, can become more dangerous than the thing we fear. The Whitlows thought they were keeping demons out by closing their doors, but what they really let in was despair, hopelessness, and decay. Fear is a liar. It tells us retreat will save us, when in truth, it only traps us. When we look back at their story, we must see not just the tragedy, but the warning. Families today may not speak of curses and demons, but fear still haunts homes. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of change. It can still close doors, limit dreams, and lock generations in patterns that destroy futures. The Whitlows lived haunted because they surrendered to fear. We must learn to live free by choosing courage, truth, and hope over the lies that fear whispers in the dark. Every family carries a story, but the Whitlows of 1895 carried something heavier, something they called a curse. To outsiders, it might have seemed like superstition, a tale whispered around fires to explain bad luck. But to the Whitlows, this curse was as real as the soil they farmed, as permanent as the mountains surrounding their land. It was not just part of their story, it was the very chain that bound their existence. The origins of the curse were said to reach back generations to a man named Thomas Whitlow, whose ambition exceeded his wisdom. Local lore claimed he turned to strange practices to bless his farm and ensure wealth for his children. Whether he dabbled in dark rituals or merely crossed the wrong neighbor, tragedy soon followed. His livestock died without cause, his crops withered, and his child was found lifeless in the cradle. From then on, every disaster, every untimely death, every misfortune carried the same explanation: the Whitlow curse. The danger of such a belief is not in whether it's true, but in how deeply it is believed. Over decades, the Whitlows wrapped their lives around this idea of doom. Misfortune wasn't seen as random, it was confirmation. A drought wasn't weather, it was punishment. A sickness wasn't natural, it was proof. And once a family convinces itself that fate is against them, they no longer live freely. They live in fear. That fear became the curse's strongest chain. The Whitlows began to see outsiders not as neighbors but as threats. They believed anyone who married into the family risked dragging in darker forces, opening doors that should remain shut. So they closed ranks. Cousin married cousin, niece married uncle, and siblings were sometimes paired in secret ceremonies. To them, this was not sin, it was sacrifice. It was their way of containing the curse, of keeping the family's suffering from spreading beyond their bloodline. But what they could not see was this: the curse was not in their blood, it was in their belief. By surrendering to fear, they bound themselves tighter than any demon could have. Each generation inherited not only the family name but also the burden of dread. Children grew up hearing the same warnings: do not trust outsiders. Do not question the curse. Do not break tradition, or you will bring destruction. Imagine the weight of that inheritance. A young boy might watch his sister waste away from illness, his parents muttering that the curse had claimed another. A daughter might be told that her duty was to marry within the family, not for love, but for survival. Every child learned early that their destiny was not theirs to shape. It was already written by forces they could not fight. The result was a family caught in a cycle of misery. The Whitlows' attempts to protect themselves only deepened their suffering. Inbreeding weakened their children, leaving them fragile, pale, and often sickly. Social isolation left them vulnerable to rumors and ridicule. Neighbors saw them as strange, cursed, even dangerous. Yet inside the family, these very hardships were twisted into further proof that the curse was alive. The more they suffered, the more convinced they became that they were doomed. It is here that we see the true power of belief. The curse, whether real or imagined, became a master that ruled the Whitlows. It dictated their marriages, their friendships, their work, their faith. It poisoned their hopes, leaving them with little vision beyond mere survival. And like a shadow stretching across generations, it became the defining mark of their identity. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the curse was never a single moment but a chain of choices. One ancestor's fear gave birth to tradition. Tradition hardened into law. Law became identity. An identity once built on fear can hold a family captive for centuries. The Whitlows were bound not just by what they believed happened long ago, but by their refusal to break free from it. They feared that stepping away from the curse would bring ruin, when in reality, it was their clinging to it that ensured their ruin. This story is not just about one family in 1895. It is a mirror for us today. How many families are still bound by curses, not of demons, but of words spoken long ago? A father tells his son he will never succeed, and the boy carries that curse into adulthood. A mother tells her daughter love is dangerous, and she grows up afraid to trust. These are curses too, chains of fear and lies passed from one generation to the next. The Whitlows show us how dangerous it is to let fear write our story. They believed the curse was in their blood, but the real curse was in their minds. And until the day their line faded into obscurity, they never broke free from its grip. The lesson is sobering. When we accept fear as truth, we hand it power to shape our lives. When we allow lies to define us, they become prisons we may never escape. The Whitlows believed they were cursed, and so they lived cursed. But here lies the hope. Curses, whether real or imagined, do not have the final word. Belief has power, but so does truth. Chains can be broken, fear can be faced, and generations can choose a new story. The Whitlows never did, but their story reminds us that we can. So when we hear of the curse that bound them, let us not simply shake our heads at their tragedy. Let us examine our own lives and ask, what curses still bind us? What fears have we allowed to rule our choices? What lies have we carried for too long? Because the truth is this: no curse has power unless we surrender to it. The Whitlows surrendered. We do not have to. The Whitlow family's story takes its darkest turn when we examine their decision to marry within their own bloodline. To outsiders, it was grotesque, unthinkable, and a violation of both moral and natural law. But to the Whitlows themselves, it was not perversion, it was preservation. They truly believed that by keeping their blood pure, they were keeping demons out. It was a twisted logic born out of fear, and it would shape the family's destiny for generations. The Whitlows lived in the shadow of the Appalachians, isolated from towns, schools, and churches. Their land was rugged, their lives hard, and their reputation already stained with whispers of a curse. As neighbors distanced themselves, the family grew increasingly insular. In their eyes, the outside world represented danger. New blood meant new doors for dark forces to enter. Outsiders couldn't be trusted because if something went wrong, they would bring ruin upon the family. So a philosophy was born: better to suffer with our own than to risk bringing in another's curse. They convinced themselves that marriage within the family was a spiritual shield. If they kept their union pure, the curse would remain contained. What began as whispers of warning hardened into a rigid law: Whitlows marry Whitlows or risk the wrath of the unknown. But such a law was more than a rule, it was a prison. Imagine being a young Whitlow in 1895, growing up under the weight of this doctrine. Love was not a choice, companionship was not a dream. Your destiny was already written. You would marry your cousin, your uncle, perhaps even your sibling, not out of passion, but out of obligation. Generations of children grew up knowing they belonged not to themselves, but to the curse that demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice it was. Their marriages produced children, but those children bore the weight of genetic weakness. Pale skin, sunken eyes, frailty, and deformities became common. Some children were born with twisted spines. Others suffered mental delays, unable to keep pace with the world around them. And still, the family pressed forward with the same ritual, refusing to see that their so-called solution was, in fact, the very cause of their suffering. But this is where the story becomes more haunting. The Whitlows did not see the sickness in their children as a consequence of inbreeding. They saw it as evidence of the curse's hunger. When a child was born weak, they whispered that the demons had taken their share. When one died in infancy, they called it the price of keeping the family safe. In their twisted worldview, every tragedy reinforced the belief that they were doing the right thing. This cycle is what made the Whitlows' story so chilling. They were not ignorant. They were trapped in a closed system of thought. Outsiders saw disease, deformity, and sorrow. Insiders saw loyalty, sacrifice, and faithfulness. The very sickness that should have awakened them to truth only drove them deeper into fear. Consider also the emotional toll. A young girl told to marry her own blood carried not just physical consequences but emotional scars. She might love someone else, dream of leaving the mountain, long for freedom, but freedom was forbidden. Her family would remind her, outsiders will destroy us. Only by marrying your kin will we survive. Her desires were crushed under the weight of tradition, her voice silenced by the authority of fear. And so, love turned into duty, and duty turned into despair. The men, too, bore this burden. Some may have resisted, but resistance was painted as betrayal. To challenge the rule was to invite the curse upon the whole family. No one wanted to be remembered as the one who defied tradition and brought doom, so they obeyed not with joy but with trembling. Generations passed this way, cousin to cousin, brother to sister, nephew to aunt. A family tree folding in on itself, branches twisting together until it became less a tree and more a knot. By 1895, the Whitlows were no longer just cursed by rumor. They were cursed by reality. Their very bodies bore the proof of what fear had wrought. Yet even as their physical condition worsened, their spiritual blindness grew stronger. They clung to the belief that they were chosen to carry this burden, that their suffering kept the curse at bay. In a strange way, it gave them identity. To be a Whitlow was to be cursed, and to be cursed was to be bound together, no matter the cost. This raises a haunting question. Was the curse ever real, or was it born from fear, from one ancestor's mistake amplified through generations? Perhaps no demon ever haunted the Whitlows. Perhaps it was fear itself that became the demon, whispering lies, twisting choices, destroying futures. If so, then their marriages were not holy shields, but shackles forged by their own hands. The story of the Whitlows is not just about a family in the mountains of 1895. It is a parable about what happens when fear dictates tradition. It shows us how human beings can justify even the most unnatural acts if they believe it keeps them safe. And it warns us how quickly protection can turn into destruction when truth is abandoned. How many families today are still marrying within the bloodline of fear, not by inbreeding, but by repeating the same destructive cycles. A father who abuses his son passes down a curse of violence. A mother who clings to bitterness teaches her daughter the same. Generations are born into chains not of demons, but of choices. And unless someone dares to break the cycle, the curse lives on. The Whitlows never broke their cycle. Their name faded into obscurity, their legacy reduced to whispers of deformity and doom. But their story echoes a timeless truth. When we bow to fear, when we justify chains as protection, we write our own destruction. Marriage within the bloodline was not just their tradition, it was their tragedy. And so we are left with this sobering reflection. The curse that bound them was not in their blood, but in their belief. They married within their own flesh to keep demons out, but in doing so they let fear rule within, and fear, more than any demon, became the destroyer of their name. The Whitlow family's story was not one hidden in some faraway, forgotten corner of history. No, their story unfolded in plain sight, within the dusty roads and candle-lit homes of a small Virginia town in 1895. The townspeople were not blind, nor were they ignorant. They saw the choices, the rituals, and the strange marriages that took place within the Whitlow bloodline. They heard the whispers of chants rising from the family's hillside property at night. They noticed the fearful eyes of children who rarely played with others, and the pale, withdrawn faces of Whitlow women who kept close to home. And yet the town said nothing. The Whitlows carried their curse with a kind of twisted pride. They believed they were protecting themselves from demons, that outsiders carried corruption while their own blood was chosen. This idea, though shocking to anyone looking in, was rationalized by them as sacred duty. But the townspeople saw more clearly than the Whitlows themselves. This was not faith, it was fear, and fear, left unchecked, can infect an entire community like a slow, spreading fire. The silence of the town was deafening. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, but when daylight returned, their lips stayed sealed. Everyone knew, but no one dared intervene. Why? Because fear did not only dwell in the Whitlow household, it lingered in the town as well. Fear of being targeted by the Whitlows, fear of being cursed themselves, fear of upsetting what had been accepted for too long. Some say the preacher tried to speak once. In a Sunday sermon, he stood at the pulpit and hinted at sins that bind families in darkness. He spoke of God's design for marriage, of purity, of the dangers of pride masking itself as holiness. The congregation shifted uneasily in their pews, some nodding, others staring hard at the ground. And though he did not name the Whitlows, everyone knew whom he meant. The Whitlows, seated stiffly in the back row, left the church that day and never returned. The preacher received an anonymous note later that week: "Keep your tongue, or it will be silenced." He burned the note, but his silence afterward became part of the town's silence too. Generations of Whitlow children bore the consequences of this secrecy. Some were born with frail bodies, others with minds that never developed fully, and still others who carried invisible wounds, shame, confusion, and despair. The town saw these children, they saw their pain, and still nothing was done. A few kind souls offered food, clothing, or a smile, but no one dared to confront the roots of the suffering. It was as though the entire town had agreed better to endure whispers than to face the truth. This silence was its own form of complicity. Every choice the Whitlows made was magnified because no one challenged it. The curse they feared, the demons they tried to keep away, was not in their blood. It was in the lies they believed, in the fear that controlled them, and in the silence of their neighbors who stood by and allowed generations to wither under the weight of superstition. But why did the town stay silent for so long? The truth lies in human nature. People often choose comfort over confrontation. They tell themselves, "It's not my business," or "Who am I to interfere?" They bury what they see beneath the soil of denial, thinking if they leave it there, it will rot away on its own. But some things don't rot, they grow. Silence can feed a curse just as much as belief in it. The Whitlow family became a living example of what happens when fear replaces faith, and when silence replaces courage. Their home on the hill became a dark reminder of what the town was unwilling to face. As years passed, stories spread, some exaggerated, some real, but all rooted in the same truth. Evil thrives not only where people act wrongly, but also where others refuse to act at all. And here lies the lesson for every reader, every listener, every soul who encounters the Whitlow story. Silence is not neutral, it is not harmless. To remain silent in the face of suffering or injustice is to allow it to continue. The townspeople had the chance to reach out, to intervene, to offer truth against lies. Some may have feared retaliation, others may have thought it wasn't their place. But history teaches us that silence can become a curse heavier than any superstition. What might have changed if one family had reached out with love? If one leader had stood boldly, refusing to back down? If one neighbor had stepped in and said, "This is not right"? The story of the Whitlows might have been written differently. The curse might have ended sooner. The children might have grown free instead of shackled by the choices of their parents. The town was not evil. It was simply silent. But silence can wear the mask of evil when it allows darkness to spread unchecked. Today, as we reflect on their story, we are reminded that the world still whispers with its own silences. Families suffer behind closed doors. Children carry wounds that no one dares speak of. Communities see but choose to turn their faces away. The lesson of the Whitlows is this: speak, act, intervene. Do not allow fear or comfort to keep you from standing for what is right, for silence is not just the absence of words, it is the quiet agreement that gives power to lies. And just like the town that watched the Whitlows suffer under their self-made curse, silence can make us witnesses to tragedy instead of participants in hope. The Whitlow family may be gone now, their house fallen to ruin, but their story lives on as a haunting echo, a reminder that when a town stays silent, the curse is not confined to one family, it belongs to all. If the Whitlow family was the root of the curse, then the children were its bitter fruit. They did not choose the path their parents carved, nor did they ask to inherit the consequences of those twisted choices. And yet it was upon their small shoulders that the weight of the curse pressed hardest. They were born into a world of shadows, raised in houses where whispers of demons and bloodlines replaced lullabies and laughter. The children of the Whitlows were unlike the children of the town. While others ran barefoot in fields, chasing fireflies and splashing in creeks, the Whitlow children were often kept indoors, guarded, hidden, and raised in an environment that prized secrecy over freedom. Some townspeople claimed it was because their parents feared outside corruption. Others suspected it was because the family did not want curious eyes to see what the curse had done to them. And indeed, the curse showed itself most clearly in the children's bodies and minds. Some were born frail, their bones fragile and spines bent as though they had been burdened since birth. Others carried faces so alike that they seemed more like mirrors of each other than siblings, an eerie resemblance born of marriages within the bloodline. And then there were those whose minds never fully developed. They wandered the halls of the Whitlow estate in silence, humming to themselves or staring out windows as if looking for something beyond their reach. But perhaps the greatest suffering was not in their bodies, but in their spirits. Imagine being a child told that your blood was both sacred and cursed, that you were special but also doomed. Imagine growing up believing that the outside world carried demons, that friendship was dangerous, and that love beyond your family was forbidden. These children were raised in a prison made not of iron bars but of fearful beliefs passed down like heirlooms. Some children tried to rebel. There are stories of one Whitlow boy who ran away at 13. He wandered into town barefoot, ragged and trembling, begging for food. He told the baker's wife that his parents said demons would drag him to hell if he left the family home. He wept as he admitted he had seen no demons, only freedom, but his escape was short-lived. His father and 2 uncles came to town that night, their faces like stone, and dragged him home by the arms. The boy was never seen again in public. Others accepted their fate quietly, because children often learn to live in the world they are given. They became shadows of their parents, reciting the same warnings, repeating the same rituals. They lit candles in the dark halls, whispered prayers against demons they could not see, and clung to one another for comfort. Some townsfolk pitied them, but pity never turned into intervention. They were left to bear their curse in silence. And yet, even within this darkness, there were sparks of light. The children, despite their suffering, carried innocence. They laughed when they could, in stolen moments when adults weren't watching. They made games out of shadows on the wall, out of stones and sticks in the yard. One neighbor remembered seeing 2 Whitlow girls twirling in their nightgowns on a moonlit night, pretending they were fairies. For a brief moment, their laughter sounded no different than any other child's, but when their mother called them back inside, the magic vanished, swallowed again by the curse. The physical signs of the curse became more apparent with each generation. By the 1890s, some Whitlow children were described as delicate as glass, unable to survive past their teenage years. Others grew into adults but carried haunted looks in their eyes, as though they were forever waiting for something terrible to arrive. It wasn't demons chasing them, it was the weight of fear, shame, and secrecy that their parents had sown into their lives. What makes their story so heartbreaking is that the children were never the villains. They were the victims of choices made long before their births. They bore the sins of their parents, the silence of the town, and the superstition of an entire lineage. They were proof that curses are not always supernatural. They can be inherited through fear, through decisions rooted in ignorance, and through the refusal of others to intervene. And so the Whitlow children became the true faces of the curse. Not because they were evil, not because they carried demons in their blood, but because they were trapped in the cycle of their family's beliefs, trapped in bodies weakened by generations of inbreeding, and trapped in a town too afraid to reach out a helping hand. The story of the Whitlow children is not just a tale of sorrow. It is a mirror held up to us, for how often, even today, do we see children paying the price for the mistakes of adults? How often do they carry the burdens of broken homes, destructive traditions, or harmful beliefs passed down without question? The Whitlow children remind us that silence and fear do not just harm the present, they cripple the future. Their laughter when it broke through was precious because it was rare. Their innocence when it shone was fragile because it was threatened. And their lives, too often cut short or broken, were the truest proof that the curse was not in demons or bloodlines, but in the choices of those who should have protected them. History has long since buried the Whitlows, but if the children's voices could rise today, they would cry out the same truth. We were only children. The curse was never ours to bear. Every curse has a breaking point. Every chain, no matter how tightly it is wound, eventually rusts and snaps. For the Whitlow family, trapped for generations in fear, superstition, and secrecy, the only true escape was never going to come through blood. It had to come through breaking the cycle. The family had convinced themselves that marrying within their own bloodline would protect them from the world, from demons, from outsiders who might taint what they believed was sacred, but in reality, it was this very belief that shackled them. They were not defending themselves from evil, they were feeding it. The curse was not in the blood itself, but in the fear-driven choices that distorted love, warped family bonds, and turned life into a prison. To understand how the Whitlows could break free, we must first understand the weight of their chains. These were not just physical chains that locked doors or kept children hidden inside the home. They were spiritual chains forged by superstition and bound by silence. A father told his son, "Do not marry outside, or demons will claim us." A mother whispered to her daughter, "Trust only the blood, for the world is poisoned." And with each passing generation, these warnings became law, until no Whitlow could even imagine a different way of living. But chains, no matter how ancient, can be broken when someone dares to question them. For the Whitlows, hope lay in the few family members who began to doubt the stories. Some children, as they grew older, looked out the windows of their home and saw other families laughing together, living without fear, thriving without rituals of protection. They saw marriages between neighbors, between strangers, and realized the world did not collapse when bloodlines mixed. These small glimpses of freedom planted seeds of rebellion in their hearts. Breaking the chains required courage of a kind that their ancestors had rarely shown. Courage to leave the estate and step into the world they had been told was filled with demons. Courage to speak truth against the family elders who clung to their beliefs like armor. Courage to imagine a life not built on curses, but on choice. For some, it meant escaping quietly in the night, walking barefoot across fields to towns that did not know their names. For others, it meant standing face to face with parents and saying, "I will not continue this." The act of breaking chains is rarely clean or easy. It is painful to turn your back on a family tradition. Even one born of superstition feels like betrayal. Many Whitlows who left carried guilt with them, guilt sown deep by generations of fear, but guilt is not the same as bondage. And those who dared to leave discovered that beyond the borders of their cursed estate, the world was wide, forgiving, and filled with possibilities that their ancestors had denied themselves. In truth, the curse was never supernatural. The Whitlow blood did not carry demons, it carried the scars of choices repeated too often. The real demons were fear, ignorance, and isolation, and those demons only lost power when the family members stopped believing in them. Breaking the chains meant breaking the lie. Some townsfolk later recalled that by the turn of the 20th century, a few Whitlow descendants began marrying outside the family. Their children grew stronger, healthier, their features no longer shadowed by the telltale signs of inbreeding. Slowly, the whispers of demons faded. Slowly, the family's name, once spoken with fear, began to blend into the ordinary rhythm of the community. What had been a bloodline bound by superstition was becoming something new, a story of survival, of transformation. But we must remember, breaking chains does not erase scars. The generations of children who suffered under the old ways carried their pain until the end of their lives. The fear they grew up with did not vanish overnight. Some never fully healed, yet even their brokenness became part of the chain, breaking, because when they told their children, "Do not live as we did," they were passing down something new, wisdom instead of superstition, freedom instead of fear. The Whitlow story teaches us something far greater than just family history. It reminds us that we too carry chains in our own lives. Some are personal, shame, guilt, or destructive habits we inherit from our families. Some are cultural, traditions, beliefs, or cycles of violence that are handed down without question. Like the Whitlows, we may be told that these chains are for our protection, when in reality, they keep us small, afraid, and trapped. Breaking them will never be easy. It will always cost something: comfort, belonging, sometimes even relationships. But the cost of staying bound is far greater. If the Whitlows had continued their cycle indefinitely, their family might have disappeared entirely, consumed by its own fear. Instead, by daring to break free, even a few of them ensured that the name and the lineage survive, not as a cursed family, but as people who finally chose life over fear. Breaking chains, then, is not about rejecting blood. It is not about hating your family or discarding your past. It is about honoring your blood enough to give it freedom. It is about loving your children enough to give them a future unbound by the mistakes of the past. The Whitlows had to learn this truth the hardest way, but their story shines as proof that no curse is eternal when someone has the courage to break it. So let the Whitlows be remembered not only for their curse, but also for their breaking. They began as a family bound by fear, but they ended as a lesson for us all. We inherit not just blood, but choices, and it is the choices we make that determine whether our children live cursed or free.